Well, I think we've given people enough time to join, so without taking up more time, more of your valuable time, let's hand it over right now to Scott Klein to get this webinar started.
All right, can everybody hear me? I'm going to assume yes. Yeah. All right, everybody, welcome to the May webinar. There we go. All right, thanks for attending. This is going to be a fun one. We've spent quite a bit of time trying to, getting this environment up and running and to demo. So hopefully this will be good. The topic of this came about because we have a lot of there's a lot of interest being driven in the community around this. This was hot starting probably a few years ago, and it's starting to catch steam. We've got a lot of clients that are looking at some hybrid scenarios. And so we thought we would do a webinar on kind of how do we do a hybrid availability and disaster recovery scenario without getting rid of our on-premises environment. And so that's the topic of today's discussion. So let's jump right in. Let's get a little of the marketing stuff out of the way. So I am Scott Klein, a senior consultant here at SQL Solutions Group. I've been here since last summer and having a blast of a time. Been working with SQL Server for a long time, so probably since 6.0. I don't know if you guys go back that far. Prior to joining SQL Solutions Group, I was a data platform evangelist for Microsoft. So I was one of the first 4. And prior to that, one of the first 4 SQL Azure MVPs, wrote a couple books on SQL Azure right at the very beginning, then joined Microsoft and did a lot of the data platform evangelist stuff at Microsoft while I was there. And got a lot of hands-on around the big data and Azure data platform things. If you have any questions about this presentation or the topic that we're going to discuss, feel free to reach out to, there's my email address. And I'll be happy to respond and happy to respond and send you any of the material. This video will also be posted on the SSG YouTube channel as well. All right, a little bit about who we are, SQL Solutions Group. This was started by about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, by Randy Knight, Microsoft Certified Master. Randy likes to call us, and we're kind of a boutique consultancy. So we like to make sure that your environments are stable and up and running and healthy. And we do that through remote DBA work. We do full scope project consulting. So if you have anything that needs, any of your SQL Server environments that need health checks or need work, we're here for that. We have been running health checks for quite a while and helping customers get their environments back, their SQL and data platform environments back on their feet and running well. We also provide some SQL coaching. So if you want to know more about how to do SQL DBA tasks and roles, then reach out to us. That's what we do, and we have a great time doing that. Okay, so with that, here's the agenda. So we're going to start with, so I've done this presentation when I was at Microsoft quite a while. And what I'd like to do is always start when I talk about this kind of stuff, is start with where has SQL Server been, where it's come from, and where it's going, to kind of build the foundation as to, why we're actually having this discussion. We're then going to talk about why we're having this discussion. And then how we actually set up this hybrid environment, what's needed. We won't spend a lot of time on this because that'll, we've got a couple slides just on the how. We'll then do a demo, and then we'll follow that by talking about some of the considerations that you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about hybrid hybrid scenario, a hybrid high availability and disaster recovery scenario. There's clearly some things that you need to keep in mind and pay attention to when you think about any hybrid scenario, but specifically for the purposes of this topic, HA and DR. All right, so let's talk the evolution of Microsoft Data Platform. I don't know how far you guys go back, but I remember SQL 6.0, 6.5, and the slide wasn't big enough to put those on here. But realistically, we can think about SQL Server being a powerhouse around 2000, 2005, and we think about all the great features that have come out in every version of SQL Server going way back. And this, by all means, is not a complete list, but we think about, SQL Server 2014 with, the kind of almost the first steps into the cloud. 2012 with the first steps into the always-on availability groups. Performance is always a big issue. Or sorry, well, let me rephrase that. Performance has always been top of mind with Microsoft and SQL Server. How do we continually make it faster and better? One of the other themes that you'll notice is the need and ability to query not just relational but non-relational data stores. So you see, where's it? Polybase, Apache Spark. Query data store, things like that. The ability to say, hey, how do we just query just not relational but non-relational unstructured data, through a single tool, through a single pane of glass. And so with 2019, you've got things like big data clusters, the ability to run on Linux now, Apache Spark, Kubernetes. Again, how do we make SQL Server faster through performance improvements? And they actually came out and did things with improved database availability by enabling fast and consistent database recovery, things like that. So Microsoft has always been focused on how do we make things available, how do we make things ability to recover from disasters, performance, and things like that. I like this slide because it kind of shows the areas that Microsoft is focusing on with each release of SQL Server. And I don't expect things to change in vNext whenever that comes out. So at that point, we'll have to update this slide. All right. So given that, and given they say, hey, with the improved database availability and the forays into that, one of the big things, and we talked about this in the last slide with SQL Server 2012, is how do we make our data highly available? And how to recover from disasters and things like that. Today, or it's the go-to has been, well, we use on-premises data centers. So I'll have using and the solutions range from availability groups to log shipping to and things like that. With availability groups, I'll have my primary and secondary in one area, or I'll just have, my primary and multiple secondaries in the same area in close proximity. Or if I want to, include a DR scenario with that, I'll have my primary and secondary in one location and another secondary in a different location. That's been the on-premises solution for quite a while, and that sort of works. Right, and it's a good solution, and Microsoft continues to improve on that. But there's downsides to that, and that's kind of the reason why we're having this discussion. So I don't know if you remember, but about 10 years ago, I don't know if you guys remember Hurricane Sandy, but this happened about 10 years ago, and this was a hurricane that most hurricanes, we spent some time living in Florida a while ago, and all the hurricanes that kind of come out in the Atlantic, they always have their eyes on Texas and Louisiana or Florida and Georgia area, right? But this one, Hurricane Sandy, this hurricane kind of came out of the south, sort of started to head toward Florida, but right as it got toward Florida, it kind of said, no, I don't want to go to Florida. And so it changed path. And this hurricane skirted up the coast of the Atlantic, of the east coast of the United States. And still, while a category 1 or 2, it landed in the Northeast. It hit New York and the New England area, right? And the problem with that was, I was at Microsoft at this time, and we had a lot of clients who were down because they had their primary and their secondary data centers in that same area. So not only did their primary data center go down, their secondary data center went down. And so they were down for quite a while. They had to recover from that. And everybody freaked out because they're like, oh my goodness, what is this hurricane doing? And no one knew. And then when it headed toward New York, major panic sort of erupted. Oh my goodness. And so that was kind of an interesting scenario, because from Microsoft, we're like, okay, that's when this topic of, hey, how do we do hybrid really started to gain traction and gain some ground. And how do we think about this? And Azure at the same time, we're like, Azure said, well, how do we think about using cloud as a HADR scenario, right, as a solution? So it was interesting that a hurricane, natural disaster, really started to promote and start gaining traction for some of these solutions. So in a typical HADR solution, we see this a lot today, right? So I've got my primary, secondary in one data center, and I'll have secondaries, one or more secondaries in the second data center. And that's what we saw, and that's what we see a lot. And that's specifically what we saw here in this scenario, right? We had customers and companies who had multiple data centers in the same region, and that caused a problem when there was a natural disaster because both data centers went out. But this is a typical scenario. Not that it's bad, but this is typically what we see, right? We got two data centers, a primary and a secondary in one data center, and then some secondaries in another data center. Depending on where those data centers are located, depending if there's a natural disaster or not, you're good, okay? But because of the momentum of, the result of what we saw with Hurricane Sandy, a lot of customers started going, well, how do we start thinking about and using the cloud as our secondary data center, right? Is there cost savings? Will it give us the performance that we need? What's the latency? So there's a lot of questions around it. How do we do that? How do you set this up? What does it mean? Or, what's the downtime? A lot of questions surrounding the idea to say, well, how do we use the cloud as our secondary data center? How do we use this as a DR site, right? The goal here is to say, well, we're not really changing much. We still have our primary and our secondary in one location. We're just taking one of our other secondaries, and instead of having it on premises, we're going to move that and put that secondary, other secondary replica in the cloud, right? The goal is, how do we connect to that? So in terms of connecting the two environments, the bottom line is that you need to have connectivity from on-premises to Azure, right? This can be done using one of two ways, right? I can use Azure Express Route, or I can use a site-to-site VPN. The site-to-site VPN is relatively cheap, probably around $100 a month, or you can use Azure Express Route. The caveat to that is it can be a little expensive, but it's super useful if you are, depending on how much, what you're putting in Azure. If you're putting a lot of things in Azure and connecting those to on-premises, then Express Route might be a viable solution. Otherwise, you might want to look at a site-to-site VPN. And what we're going to use today in this demo is a site-to-site VPN, right? Pretty simple to set up, and actually pretty good if you're going to just do a demo or do some testing, right? So that's the premise of this, is say, well, instead of having and driven by this natural disaster, the premise of this discussion is going, okay, well, how do I take my secondary data center and really put that in the cloud, right? And that's what we're talking about. So we'll actually see this in the demo. Before we get to that, what I want to do is talk about and really define what we mean by high availability and disaster recovery, and that what that means in terms of your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective. So when we talk about high availability, we're essentially saying these are resources that will be available and reachable with the least possible downtime in the event of a failure, right? My resources need to be highly available. They need to be reachable. I need to be able to get to them and with almost little downtime, right? That's what we talk about. So resources in the case of what's this? And we're talking about in this case, we mean SQL Server instances and databases, right? Specifically. When we talk about disaster recovery, that means essentially, how do I recover from a failure? This is the process of restoring the functionality in the case of a catastrophic loss. So in the case of that hurricane, that hit the New England area, what was their downtime and what was the process and how long did it take them to restore and get back up and running, right? So disaster recovery is the process of recovering from that natural disaster. High availability is that, are they available, right? Disaster recovery is, well, if they go down, how do I recover from that? And these play a critical role into recovery time objective and recovery point objective, right? Recovery time objective is how much downtime is acceptable to recover from disaster recovery or planned outages, okay? Recovery time objectives is typically measured in the terms of nines, right? So for example, 99.9% or 99.99%, right? So like 3 nines is about 9 hours a year. 5 nines is about 5 minutes a year. So what's an acceptable downtime to you? Recovery point objective is in terms of, that's the number of minutes or the level of acceptable loss in the event of a disaster, right? So is the acceptable amount of data loss, is that 0? Is it 15 minutes? Is it, an hour? What is the acceptable amount of data loss that's acceptable to you? And so when we talk about high availability and disaster recovery, RTO and RPO is very much part of that discussion. What's acceptable downtime and how much data can you lose, right? So when we talk about HADR, what's the technologies that allow you to meet those requirements? So when we talk about technologies, here's the technologies that are supported when we talk about hybrid high availability and disaster recovery. Obviously, we're going to talk about availability groups, and this has been around since 2012, but you can also use database mirroring and log shipping. These are very valid, but what we're going to demo today is availability groups, simply because of the benefits you get with availability groups. Zero data loss, multiple secondaries, automatic failover, and readable secondaries. Right, so there's benefits to doing always on availability groups. Right, so when we talk about HADR and your RPO and RTO, what technologies are you going to use and what is meaningful for you. But in this demo and this discussion, we're going to use always on availability groups. Okay. I should say, if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat and we'll get to those. Jason, we have any questions yet?
None so far.
Not so far. Okay, good. So with that, let's jump out into a demo. Okay, so what I have here is I've got 2 virtual machines. I've got node 1 and node 3. I don't need a demo. I don't need to pull up node 2. So here I am in node 1. I've got A, B, and C, right? And these are all part of, you notice here, the availability group. So my A is my primary, B is my secondary, and C is my secondary, okay? The reason I point these out is because A and B are my on-premises nodes, and C is my node in Azure. So this is A is my primary here in the office. B is a secondary here in the office, and C is a secondary in Azure. So I can see that by going to my Azure portal, and there is node C. Okay. And so what we've done is the way we've domain joined this is that we created in Azure, we created a virtual network, and we created a site-to-site VPN. And I think toward the presentation, we'll talk about that a little bit. But we created a site-to-site VPN, domain joined this node to our domain, and then added that to the cluster. So you can see C is added to the cluster. We're going to actually talk about this a little bit. So how does this work, right? So to demo this really quick, you can see on here on node A. So I'm on node A. I've got a simple database called AG test, and a simple table called friends with simply 2 columns. And so I would say select everything from friends. I've got Randy, Scott, Jared, and Jason. These are all the phenomenal my phenomenal coworkers here at SSG. And if you're paying attention, if you ever want to work for SSG, your first name has to have 5 letters in it. Okay, just a FYI. All right, so if I go over to node C here, oh, where is node? There it is. Where's it going? All right, here we go. Okay, so I got node C, same thing. So if I say select star from friends, there I am. I have the same, got the same nodes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just to show how that a simple AG test. What I'm going to do is just go back over to my node A, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to insert a record into this data into this table, and we'll see it replicate to the node in Azure, right? So I'm just going to say insert into. Oh, spell it right, into friends, name, values. We need a good call Phil. There we go. So Phil now works in SSG. All right, we're gonna run that. When we're affected, we now query this query. So there's Phil. We now go over to our node, our cloud node. Let's query that again. There's Phil, right? So it's a very simple example, but what we've done is we've just replicated, set up an availability group that, now we have data replicating from on-premises. We could actually, if we want to, let's go to, we can go back to our first node. Let's go here to test and say select our from friends. You see this on node 2 as well. Okay. All right, so simple example, but what that means is that I now have data replicating from on-premises to the cloud, right? So what does this mean? Okay, so let's take this a little further. So what I've got is go over to my the dashboard. There's my 3 nodes. And a couple things to pay attention to here, and we're going to point this, and I'll get into this in a little further in the presentation. Notice that my on-prem primary and secondaries are in synchronous commit mode, and my cloud VM, my cloud node C, is asynchronous commit manual failover. It is synchronizing. And this is critical, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but just keep note of that right now, right? So primary, secondary, or synchronous. My cloud node is asynchronous. Okay. I also want to point out too that one of the things that I did, so if we look at the availability group if we look at my availability group, there's a couple things I want to point out, right? We talked about this in a little bit. I've got synchronous commits for A and B, asynchronous for C. But here's the critical thing, right? Or just something to consider, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail. Right now, all my nodes are readable, right? So obviously my primary and secondaries on premise is readable, but by default, they're not readable, right? So I had to go in here after the fact and say, yep, let's make these readable secondaries. So, and that was simple to do. But what you need when you're setting this up, say, okay, do I need my secondaries readable or not? And this actually has an impact on your licensing, and we'll actually talk about that shortly. But things to pay attention to, right? What is my availability mode, and do I want my secondaries? Do I want them readable or not? Okay. Now, so in this scenario, we think about, all right, well, how does this really replace my secondary data center, right? If you think about, and we'll talk about this from a cost perspective shortly, but let's pull up the VM again, right? Right now, and we'll talk about cost, we'll talk about some of the things to consider here momentarily. But right now, this is a fairly, it's not a small VM, it's a pretty decent VM, right? It is 2 vCPUs, 8 gigabytes of memory. So we're probably not paying that much a month for this VM. But let's think about it from a scalability perspective, right? So I've got high availabilities and disaster recovery going on. But let's say something happened to my on-premise environment, and my primary and secondary nodes go down. How do I recover from that? And how do I scale this to the point where it now becomes usable, right? So obviously the thing to do is, oh shoot, my VM is still up, so I could actually come in here and just say, hey, let's do a failover, right? And I want to failover to, I want this now to become my node, right? My primary node, right? So now I fail over, I've got my primary node up, but how do I now scale that to handle the load? Well, it's super simple to scale this up, because now I just go in here to the portal and say, I can scale this out to across multiple, add additional VMs to this, and I can then scale this up. So I can say, here's my availability and scaling. Oop. Oh, wrong plate. Well, I'll come back to that. But the whole goal is to say, well, now I can come into the portal and scale this up, both in terms of size and the number of nodes, if I had put this in an availability group and things like that. So now I can, the key here is that I'm just paying for what I use. So in the terms of, if I need to now make this my primary and fail over to here, I scale this up, the users are running, and when I'm all done and I get my on-premises environment back online, I then scale this back down. And what I've done is I've just paid for the resources that I've used. So instead of paying, when I would go and present this, at Microsoft, I would ask, well, I'd ask the attendees in my presentations, how much are you guys paying for your secondary data center? And how often do you use that secondary data center? And the question was, well, we're paying way too much and we don't use it that much, right? So now what we've done is we've just lowered the cost and drastically, because we're just paying for the resources that we use instead of having a lot of hardware just sitting in a secondary data center. So this is appealing to people. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. So let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so let's talk about some things to consider real quick, right? Because we could set this up, but what do you have to keep in mind? So what we've done is we've deployed one or more secondary replicas to the cloud for that connect to your on-premises SQL server. and these replicas are continuously synchronizing. And as you saw when I inserted a record in the on-premises table, it was automatically synchronized to my to the VM, my node in the cloud, my readable secondary in the cloud. So that was awesome. But the things to keep in mind are, one, there are some political considerations we have to think about. So, for example, there are some countries where legally the data cannot leave the borders of that country. So this, you might have to think about, well, how do does this solution then make sense or does it not, right? So there are a few countries where they say, yep, my data can't leave the borders of the country, so this might not be a solution. How do we solve that, right? The other thing to keep in mind is latency. Obviously, there's going to be some latency depending on where your on-premises is versus your Azure data center. If you do have to fail over to the cloud, what's that latency going to be? Because you now have all your traffic going to the cloud. So there's going to be some latency there, albeit it's going to be a temporary, right, until you get your on-premises back up, but you do have to take that into consideration. But the goal with this is to, hey, how do we lower our total cost of ownership, right? So now instead of spending a lot of money on a secondary data center, what I'm doing is I'm paying very little for, or probably a fraction of the cost for a VM and storage over an entire secondary data center, right? But some more things to consider here real quick. And well, I'll just get into this. The things to, when you create your Azure VM, the things to be aware and are the Azure VM drives. So by default, when you create your Azure VM, well, let me restate that, a SQL VM, by default, you get a data drive, a log drive, and a tempdb drive. And by default, those are drives F, G, and D, right? So what you need to make sure is that the drive mappings on your VM are the same as your on-premises drive mappings. So when you're creating your VM, you can actually change the VM letters in the portal when you're creating the VM. It is difficult to do and not well, and I'll say, you know, the documentation actually states don't change these drive mappings after the fact, but it's doable. The problem is if you reboot your server, they may go back to the way they were, but you can change those. So the point of this bullet point is make sure your drive mappings, because obviously if you're setting up an AG, your drive mappings have to be the same. Just make sure that when you set up your VM that you change those and they match your on-premises. The other things I think we've already pointed out is your availability mode, right? So we talked about high availability disaster recovery earlier, and these availability modes, these availability modes, they tie 100% to HADR. So remember that A and B are on premises and C is in Azure. A and B are synchronous and C is asynchronous. The reason for that is synchronous commit is a pure HA mode, and asynchronous mode is more of a DR, a disaster recovery mode. So when we say asynchronous, or sorry, when we say synchronous, the synchronous commit mode really that emphasizes high availability over performance, right? So at the cost of increased transaction latency, these are where the nodes are in close proximity to each other, right? So obviously we have A and B right next to each other. Asynchronous, this is a pure disaster recovery solution. This works well when the availability replicas are distributed over some distances, right? So in this case, you know, I've got my A and B sitting next to each other here in the office, and I've got C in Azure, right? So this really has to do with, you know, transaction commits and hardening of the logs to disk. So when we talk about you know, availability modes, you know, A and B are synchronous and C is asynchronous because we're talking about HA and DR at the same time, right? All right. Let's talk about read only, right? We have to, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but Read-only means, are your secondaries, you see over there in the screenshot, readable secondary. Do you want your secondaries read-only? And this, you may say, well, yes and no. The reason I bring this up is because there are some licensing benefits if those secondaries are not, if your secondaries are not readable, especially your one in the cloud. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are some benefits to that. There are some licensing benefits to that. And so we'll talk about that in when I get to the cost slide. But these are things to consider heavily when you're creating your hybrid AG environment, right? What are my drives? What are my availability modes? And are my secondaries read-only? Okay. Let's talk about, so we'll talk about where to find some information. And there is stuff all over creation on the Microsoft Docs site. So here's what you need to think about. Site to site and connecting networks. So whenever you want to create a site-to-site VPN or express route, here's some docs on how to do that and connecting your networks. These are some good docs. When I actually remember when I first set this and did this demo at Microsoft many years ago, they had this blog post that walked you through step by step on how to create this up. Now the blog post really was an Azure to Azure. So what it did is it had you create Azure VMs in one data center, and then like we did here, a failover node in another Azure data center. What I did is I kind of took that and said, well, I'm going to do what we did here, my on-premises nodes and my Azure node. What was funny is that if you printed out that blog post and pasted it in Word, it was a 98-page doc. I mean, it walked you through step by step by step on how to set this up, right? So at the very end, if it didn't work and you messed it up, then you're in the wrong business, because it was step by step and it was awesome. That, unfortunately, doc does not exist anymore. I looked high and low for that just to see if it still existed. But here's our good docs on how to essentially connect your on-premises and Azure environments, right, using site to site and connecting your networks. Once you've got that going, it's super simple to connect and set up your AGs. Okay, so again, happy to send you this deck so you have this information. Okay, all right, let's talk cost a minute, right? So again, when I would present this, we always talked about how much you're paying for your secondary data center. Now, I do want to point out, so in this scenario, what we did is we created a simple VM, and it wasn't this powerful here, but realistically, that VM is probably half that, and it's got a couple drives. But what we have to think about too is there's a couple, when you go and provision your VM, there's a couple, and you see them here on the slide, there's a couple spots where you can say, hey, if you have software assurance and you want to bring your own Windows and SQL Server licenses with you, you can save up to 49 and 43% of the cost of this VM. So the cost you see above, that means, that includes the licensing cost for Windows and SQL Server. But if you're bringing your own license, you can drastically cut the cost of this VM. And the other thing I want to highlight too, and that's this read-only secondary, that's this bullet point down here, the licensing bullet point. During the creation of your SQL VM, there's a spot in there, and I tried to find a screenshot. There's a spot in there that says, hey, is this VM used as a disaster recovery node? Which means, and the caveat to that though is you cannot make it it has to be a read-only secondary, right? You can't, let me go back. In other words, what that means is this readable secondary, that says no, right? So when we say, is this a readable secondary, this slot here, over here, readable secondary, that has to say no, okay? But what that means is, in terms of this, and that's pointed out in this licensing link here, is that if that's no, and when you create the VM, there's a option in the creation of that VM that says, hey, if this is a disaster recovery node, then if your replica in Azure specifies a DR in the scenario, your license for the SQL Server will not be charged, right? Because it'll be zero cost, okay? But you have to say that this is a disaster recovery node, which means that you have to say no there. All right, well, that's going to say no. Okay, for your readable secondary. Okay, so from a cost perspective, the only reason I point this out is, but I also want to point out something critically important here too. One of the things to keep in mind when looking at the cost of the cloud is the types of hardware, right? So anytime Microsoft does a great job in keeping their hardware up to date. So when we talk about, hey, this is 4 virtual CPUs and 18 gigabytes of memory, this is enterprise class hardware, right? So we need to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges, right? So you may have, you may not have this the same type of enterprise class hardware that you that Azure has that you may have in on premises. So I get keeping that in mind because we want to be able to compare apples to apples. We're always talking about the cost may seem high there, but we're talking about enterprise class hardware, right? And that's what you're paying for. But it's still, even at that, the reason I bring this up is because it's still significantly cheaper than paying for an entire secondary data center. Because with this, I fail over, I scale it up and scale it out. And when I'm done, I scale it back down and I'm just paying for those resources that I need, right? And this is super appealing to customers who need that, we're trying to lower their TCO, okay? Now, we've talked about in terms of, this we specifically talked about, it's a high availability solution with some disaster recovery sprinkled in with this secondary node in Azure. But there are other solutions, and we talked about this a little bit earlier with that slide, right? If I'm just looking for some pure DR, I can always back up my databases to Azure. And this has been available since, I think, SQL Server 2014, right? Simply back up to Azure, backup database to and a URL to an Azure storage account, right? You have to create a credential first, but other than that, that's a disaster recovery solution as well. I can also do log shipping if I want, and that's a great scenario because that can be automated, right? I can basically, back up my log, ship that to my secondary data center or even to Azure, and then restore that. Right? That can be actually automated. There's some virtualization scenarios as well, virtualization solutions as well. I'm not too familiar with those, but I know those exist. So it just really depends on what your requirements are. We focus specifically on availability groups, and we talked about this with the benefits of multiple secondaries and things like that. Now, I do want to spend just a couple minutes talking about Jason, are there any questions?
Yeah, let me first say that the links you shared on that documents page, I've posted those in the chat.
Okay.
So very handy for everybody. Randy and I answered a couple questions that Kalika had about deprecated old platforms, but two pending questions. Michael says, for disaster recovery, how do you ensure you have zero data loss at DR using SQL Server in a situation where the primary site crashes?
That's synchronous. Yeah, that's the synchronous mode. So if we go back, so you can find that. Yeah, so that's the synchronous mode. So there's really no data or data. There's no data loss in that scenario.
Okay. And then
But feel free to, if you have any more questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my address back up there, and they can ask more questions.
Yeah.
More
And
information.
then second question, what are Microsoft alternatives for third-party tools for storage, parentheses, data, snapshots for DR on-premise?
What are
So Microsoft alternatives for, in other words, not third-party, but Microsoft.
I'm not quite, so for data solutions?
Yeah, for storage snapshots for DR on-premise.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's the last one in the queue.
okay.
Maybe some clarity there would be.
Yeah, let me do this.
Yeah, anonymous, if there's a different way for you to ask that question, we can try that again.
Yeah, and feel free, there's my email address. Feel free to email us for clarification if anybody wants further clarification.
Yeah.
Or has any additional questions, feel free to ask that. Do you want to talk about the site-to-site stuff? Okay. All right. So, all right, everybody. Let's see, what do we got? All right. So I do want to point out, we always talk about our next webinar. So our next SQL Server webinar, we've got some irons in the fires to what we're going to do, but it's going to be totally awesome. I can promise you that. All presented from the fine folks here at SSG. The date is still TBD. So what we would ask is that you pay attention to your email for some announcements coming out very soon. I can promise you this is going to be super fun, super engaging, and I would highly recommend that you attend. So please check your email for more information about that. So anyway, thanks for coming. Any more questions any more questions from our lovely audience? If not, I'll put my email address back up. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or want the slide deck or have any additional questions. Reach out. Otherwise, everybody, thank you for attending and for watching, and have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on our next webinar.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We'll be sharing this video tomorrow. Take care.